At exactly 9:17 a.m., January 22nd, 1943, a young American officer pressed his cheek to the stock of a rifle no one in his battalion respected. Second Lieutenant John George, 27 years old, state champion marksman, 0 kills in combat, crouched inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. Through the battered firing slit, his scope pointed at a massive banyan tree 240 yards away, a tree where something had moved. For 6 weeks, the men around him had mocked that rifle. A Winchester Model 70, a mail-order sweetheart. A sporting toy with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a Griffin and Howe mount gear they said belonged in deer season, not on Guadalcanal. But none of those men were laughing anymore. The groves west of Point Cruz had become a killing ground. 11 Japanese snipers were operating somewhere in those trees. In just 72 hours, they had killed 14 soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment, men shot at water points, on patrols, even while walking under branches that seemed harmless minutes before. The commander was out of options. Patrols kept losing men. Machine gun teams couldn't see the threat. Mortars hit jungle and nothing else. So the battalion turned to the one man carrying a rifle nobody wanted to take seriously. If George was right about his rifle, someone in that banyan tree was about to die. If he was wrong, someone in the bunker would. Before that morning at Point Cruz, nothing about John George's war suggested he was destined for anything unusual. He was a junior officer in an ordinary infantry regiment, a National Guard lieutenant suddenly thrown into one of the Pacific's bloodiest campaigns. And despite being one of the most talented riflemen in the state of Illinois, he had gone months without firing a single round in actual combat. His rifle, though, had sparked attention from the moment it arrived. Back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the package had looked more like a Christmas gift than military equipment. A private crate, marked fragile, containing a Winchester Model 70 George had bought with 2 years of National Guard pay. The stock was clean, the action smooth, the Lyman Alaskan scope mounted with Griffin and Howe precision. It was, objectively, a beautiful rifle light, balanced, almost elegant. None of that impressed the Army. When George unpacked it, the armorer didn't even hide his smirk. "Is this thing for deer?" he asked, "or for Germans?" Other officers weren't any kinder. A bolt-action gun in a war that demanded rapid fire? A civilian sporting rifle next to rows of M1 Garins? It was ridiculous. A waste, a novelty. His company commander flatly told him to leave the rifle in his tent and carry a proper weapon. George carried the Garand, just like everyone else. He fought the early part of the Guadalcanal campaign with standard gear, just another lieutenant crawling through mud and jungle. At that point, the rifle he'd sacrificed so much money for wasn't even on the island. His unit shipped out before it arrived. While the ship crossed the Pacific, George spent nights watching other men clean their M1S field strip Brownings and oil Springfield rifles. His own prized Model 70 was sitting in a warehouse in Illinois, waiting for military mail routing to catch up with a battlefield half a world away. By the time it finally reached him in late December 1942, the 132nd Infantry had already suffered through one of its hardest fights, Mount Austin. The Marines who had held Guadalcanal since August had never fully cleared that mountain, and the Army inherited the job. From December 17th onward, George's battalion clawed up steep ridges into fortified Japanese positions, 47 bunkers, interlocking fire, men who fought to the last. It took 16 days to capture the western slope. The regiment paid for every yard with casualties. 34 killed, 279 wounded. And through all of it, George never fired his Winchester. He didn't even have it. When the crate finally arrived late December, soaked with Pacific humidity, it felt almost anticlimactic. He unwrapped it, cleaned the cosmoline from the bore, and remounted the scope. The rifle weighed almost exactly what a Garand did, just under 10 pounds, but felt entirely different in the hands. The balance was forward, the bolt stroke glass smooth, the trigger breaking around 3.5 pounds with a crystalline snap. To George, it felt like coming home. To everyone else, It looked like a liability. The M1 Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds ready to fire as fast as a man could pull the trigger. The Model 70 was 5 rounds, bolt action, 1 shot at a time. And the jungle, thick with rain and mud, was the worst place imaginable for delicate optics and sporting mounts. Then the battalion reached the coastal groves near Point Cruz and everything changed. This part of the island wasn't fortified like Mount Austin. There were no bunkers, no trenches, no clear lines. Instead, there were trees, giant banyans with trunks 8 feet thick, branches sprawling like cathedral beams, leaves forming canopy shadows that swallowed the sky. Somewhere in those branches, Japanese snipers waited from before dawn until after dusk. They climbed 80 or 90 feet up and disappeared into the foliage. They could watch trails for hours without shifting a muscle. The slightest ripple of movement could kill a man. And men were dying. Corporal Davis was shot while filling canteens. 2 more killed in the groves during a routine patrol. 1 man took a bullet through the neck from a tree the squad had passed twice. 14 Americans in 72 hours. It wasn't combat. It was harvesting. The battalion commander needed someone, anyone, who could turn this invisible battlefield into something he could understand. Someone who could see what others missed. Someone who had the discipline to sit still, scan slowly, and place a single precise shot into a space the width of a helmet. That night, he summoned George. Not because George had rank, not because George asked, but because the commander had run out of options and George was the only man on the island carrying a rifle built for hitting problems no one else could even see. At sunrise on January 22nd, George slid into the captured Japanese bunker overlooking the Point Cruz groves. Broken beams, shattered concrete, and jungle vines clung to the structure like it was refusing to accept which army owned it now. He carried only what mattered: his Model 70-60 rounds in stripper clips, a canteen, and a quiet certainty that this morning would determine whether the last 6 weeks of mockery had been justified or whether those laughs would die in the trees. The sun was just cresting the canopy when he settled into position. The air shimmered with heat and insect noise. The jungle wasn't silent. It never was. But George had long ago learned the difference between sound you can ignore and movement you cannot. He placed his eye behind the Lyman Alaskan scope 2.5x power. Nothing special by modern standards, but enough to show small things the naked eye would miss. He had spent years training his brain to filter chaos, to scan left to right, top to bottom, quadrant by quadrant, every pass as slow as a breath. At 9:17 a.m., something shifted. A branch just a slight tremor 80 or 90 feet up the trunk of a massive banyan tree. No wind, no birds landing. A human error in a place where every Japanese sniper counted on perfection. George froze. Then the branch twitched again. There. A shape. A dark patch where the natural patterns of light and shadow didn't match. A man wedged into the fork of 3 thick branches, facing east toward the American trail. The sniper was waiting for the kind of target George had spent the morning praying wouldn't show up. George adjusted 2 clicks, right for a slight breeze. He let his breathing settle. At Camp Perry, he had learned that a rifle tells the truth only to someone calm enough to listen. The shot broke like glass. The figure jerked. Then gravity pulled him through 90 feet of branches before the body thudded into the wet jungle floor. The first kill took 1 shot. But there was always a second man. Japanese sniper doctrine paired shooters, a spotter, a partner, or a second rifle to finish the job if the first man revealed the enemy's location. George stayed behind the scope, tracing the tree lines, searching for an angle that didn't belong. He found the partner at 9:43, moving down the trunk of a tree 60 yards north of the kill. The man was cautious, deliberate, trying to reposition without exposing himself. George led him slightly, just a fraction, and fired. The second sniper toppled backward, his rifle clattering through branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills, and suddenly the groves felt different. George reloaded from a stripper clip, hands steady, breath controlled. This wasn't bravado. This was years of discipline finally being allowed to matter. By 11:21, the jungle reminded him it was still a battlefield. A Japanese round smashed into a sandbag 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt and grit into his eyes. George rolled left, hugging the bunker wall. If the bullet had hit a heartbeat earlier, he would have been the one falling through branches. He waited 3 full minutes. Snipers often fired once and relocated immediately and then crawled back into position. Slow, measured, careful. The shooter had moved. Of course he had. George scanned the southwest tree line, each banyan a potential hiding place. At 11:38, he spotted a dark mass, 73 feet up, a clustered group of trees. The sniper had relocated to a different branch, but had stayed in the same tree. A mistake. A small one, but fatal. George fired. The man fell without a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. The battalion's gossip lines ignited. Word traveled across companies in minutes. Men who had spent weeks calling his rifle a toy suddenly wanted to watch him work, to see what a mail-order sweetheart could actually do in real combat. George refused every request. Spectators made noise. Noise got men killed. That afternoon, the Japanese changed tactics. Movement in the trees stopped. The groves went still, too still. Snipers who had spent days shifting branches to mask their presence now froze completely. By evening, George had glassed hundreds of yards of canopy without a single target revealing itself. When he returned to Battalion HQ around 1,600 hours, Captain Morris was waiting. The sarcasm was gone from his voice. "You're going back out at dawn. Day 2. The rains, the long shots, and the mortars." January 23rd began, with sheets of tropical rain pounding the ground, so hard visibility collapsed past 100 yards. The groves blurred into a wall of gray-green motion. George used the storm as camouflage, slipping into the bunker before dawn and waiting, listening to the rain hammer the metal roof and leaves above him. At 8:15, the downpour eased. By 8:45, the world had shapes again. At 9:12, George found his first sniper of the day. The Japanese shooter had climbed into position during the rain, using the noise to hide his movements. A clever adaptation after watching 5 comrades fall the day before. This man had set up 290 yards out, farther than the earlier snipers. A difficult shot through dense foliage, at the extreme limit of what 2.5x magnification could reliably identify. George compensated for distance. Exhaled. Fired. The sniper fell. But the response that followed was nothing George expected. At 9:57, mortar rounds began landing around the bunker. The Japanese had triangulated his general position from the previous day's shots. They bracketed him first 40 yards short, then 20 yards short. The third volley was going to hit the bunker dead on. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north. Mortar explosions erased the bunker seconds after he cleared it. He dove into the shadow of a fallen tree and set up a new hide, 120 yards from the smoking crater where he'd been sitting. The afternoon became a duel, not one against a single sniper, but against an enemy that had finally realized one man was responsible for the sudden silence in the trees. At 14:23, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he found and eliminated his 8th, a man who had climbed almost 100 feet up, using elevation for concealment. But when the sun shifted, the sniper's silhouette betrayed him. By 1700, Captain Morris pulled George back. 9 hours in the grove had drained him. 8 snipers were dead. 4 misses. The battalion commander now considered George a strategic asset. Tomorrow, there would be more work. Day 3, the bait, the trap, and the double kill. January 24th began with torrential rain again. George moved early, relocating to a new position, a cluster of rocks used by Marines as a machine gun nest weeks earlier. From here, he had elevation, overlapping angles, fields of fire the Japanese wouldn't predict. By 7:43, the rain tapered to a drizzle. At 8:17, George found sniper number 9. The man was seated in a palm tree 190 yards away, only 40 feet above the ground. Palm fronds hid most of his body, a clever hide from ground level, but from George's elevated rocks, he could see directly into the fronds. Too easy. George froze. Something felt wrong. After 3 days of killing, the remaining Japanese snipers were the best of the best. They wouldn't make amateur mistakes. They wouldn't sit exposed in a palm tree at the perfect elevation for an American shooter unless they wanted him to take that shot. It was bait. George lowered his rifle and began scanning everything within 300 yards of the decoy. Every tree, every vine, every patch of dark shadow. It took 11 long minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. 91 feet up a banyan tree northwest of the palm, concealed by branches and vines on 3 sides. The sniper had a perfect line of sight to the fallen tree where George had worked the previous day. He was waiting for George to fire at the bait, then reveal his muzzle flash. George needed a way to use their trap against them. He made his decision. He aimed at the bait in the palm, fired. The decoy sniper dropped. George immediately swung toward the banyan. For half a second, the real sniper did exactly what doctrine demanded. He turned toward the sound. A slight shift of shoulder, a flicker of movement. George fired before the man completed the turn. 2 shots, 2 dead. Trap reversed. But the moment those 2 rounds cracked through the groves, George's position was blown. At 8:34, machine gun fire shredded the rocks where he had been positioned 6 seconds earlier. George slid into a drainage ditch, pressing himself into the mud. Bullets tore through vines overhead. He waited until the forest went still again. He moved east, then north, then into another shell crater filled with rainwater. He lowered himself until only his eyes and the top of his head rode above the surface. The Winchester stayed vertical, barrel up, to keep water out. 2 snipers remained. Then 1. Then the final duel began. Day 4, the ground hunter and the last stand. By now, Japanese doctrine had shifted completely. The last sniper was no longer in the trees at all. He was crawling across the jungle floor, using ferns and fallen branches for cover, approaching George's previous escape routes. This wasn't sniping. This was stalking. At 9:47, George spotted movement at the edge of his vision low to the ground, 30 or 40 yards out, sliding parallel to the tree line. The sniper was hunting him. A second Japanese soldier moved nearby, backup or partner. It didn't matter. Together they were closing in on the rocks, expecting to find George where he had fled under machine gun fire hours earlier. George stayed still, submerged, waiting for a mistake. At 10:03, the first man reached the machine gun nest and took position, facing east, watching the ditch. The second Overwatch sniper waited 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen tree, covering the same angle. Another trap? George had no clean way to kill both quickly with a bolt-action rifle. He sank deeper into the crater, waited, thought like them. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood, gestured to his partner, and both men began sweeping east, directly past George's hidden position. When their backs were exposed, George rose silently from the water. He fired. The closer soldier dropped. He worked the bolt, fired again. The Overwatch man fell before he could bring his rifle up. 11 kills in 4 days. 12 rounds fired at snipers. 11 hits. The groves of Point Cruz, once a killing field, went quiet. But one final danger remained. A Japanese infantry patrol, moving toward the gunfire. They found footprints. They followed them to the crater. The moment one soldier looked down and met George's eyes, the firefight erupted. George shot him point blank from the water, chambered another round, shot 2 more at the rim, then ran north through the undergrowth as bullets cracked behind him. He reached American lines at 11:13. A.M., soaked, muddy, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. The battalion commander asked for his report. George gave the numbers. And the war, at least this part of it, would never see Point Cruz the same way again. When George staggered back into American lines late that morning, mud still dripping from his uniform and rifle, the battalion commander didn't congratulate him. He didn't celebrate the 11 kills or the fact that no American had died in the groves since George took up position. He asked a single question. Can you teach other men to do what you just did? Guadalcanal was changing. The Japanese were evacuating. New operations were coming. But what George had accomplished, precision, patience, economy of movement was something the U.S. Army had never formally trained for. The Marines had experimented with sniper doctrine, but the Army's structure was still based on mass rifle fire and squad-level maneuver. George was the first real proof that one well-trained man with the right rifle could shift the momentum of an entire battlefield. Division headquarters had tools waiting. 14 Springfield 1,903 rifles fitted with long unertl scopes left behind by Marine units rotating off the island. They had better magnification than George's Lyman, heavier barrels, and optics built for long-range precision. The regiment also had something rare: 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. They weren't snipers, but they had talent. They had trigger discipline. And, under someone like George, they could become something the Army had never fielded before. George agreed on one condition. He kept his Winchester Model 70. 3 days later, he stood on a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field, looking at 40 men lined up in the heat. Most had never fired a scoped rifle in their lives. Many assumed sniping was simply shooting farther. George corrected that immediately. He began with fundamentals: breathing control, bone support, not muscle support, trigger squeeze so clean it felt like breaking a glass rod, reading wind through mirage, leaves, and the way grass leaned at distance. The Springfield rifles were heavy 11 pounds with the unertl attached. Their scopes were long and sensitive, demanding careful carry and stable firing rests. George taught the men to turn jungle terrain into a shooting platform: a rock for rear support, a fallen log for a front rest, a sandbag scrounged from a destroyed bunker. For 3 days straight, the men fired at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving silhouettes, then partial targets buried in foliage. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could reliably hit man-sized silhouettes at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter roles that could switch after each kill to keep both men sharp. On February 1st, they went to war. Dawn operations west of the Matnacow River proved everything George believed. The teams moved like ghosts, picked their shots, and delivered results that stunned the regiment. 23 Japanese soldiers killed in one day, 0 American casualties. And just like that, John George, once the lieutenant with a toy rifle, had created the U.S. Army's first true wartime sniper section. Guadalcanal ended quietly for George. A rifleman's war in the banyan trees had turned into a different battle, one fought from a cot in a field hospital near Henderson Field. The Japanese were evacuating the island. The last pockets of resistance were collapsing, and the sniper section George had built was now a fully operational asset. But before he had time to recover, new orders arrived. Pacific Command was assembling an experimental unit, a long-range penetration force designed to operate behind Japanese lines in some of the worst terrain on Earth. The mission would be deep inside Burma, far from roads, supply lines, or friendly support. It required officers who could move silently, shoot precisely, and lead men through jungle that swallowed entire armies. George volunteered immediately. His Winchester traveled with him. India. A new war. A new unit. In early 1943, hundreds of American soldiers disembarked in India for a mission without a proper name. The men called themselves something that would soon become legend: Merrill's Marauders, the 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional. 3,000 men, 3 battalions. Modeled after the British Chindits, masters of guerrilla warfare in the jungle, George was assigned as a rifle platoon leader. Officially, the Army still had no sniper MOS, no doctrinal slot for a man like him. Unofficially, every senior officer who saw his file knew exactly what he could do. And Burma would demand all of it. The Winchester transforms again. The Burma March would cover hundreds of miles on foot up mountains, across rivers, through vines and bamboo thick enough to tear uniforms off the body. Every ounce of weight mattered. George took a hard look at his beloved Model 70. He removed the heavy Lyman Alaskan and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330, same 2.5x magnification, 8 ounces lighter. He swapped the stock for a synthetic version, shaving more weight from the rifle. It wasn't much on paper. But in Burma, ounces meant miles. The Long March. In February 1944, the marauders crossed into Burma. The Japanese believed their northern jungle was impassable for a large force. They were wrong, but crossing it came with a cost. Within weeks, men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases multiplied. Pack mules slipped off cliffs and had to be shot. Half the unit was sick before seeing a major battle. Still, they pushed forward toward the airfield at Myitkyina, a vital link in Allied supply routes to China. Combat came in bursts, quick ambushes, firefights at 20 or 30 yards, and the constant danger of machine gun nests hidden in foliage. George fired his Winchester only 3 times during the entire march. Once at 412 yards, a Japanese officer directing troops at a river. Once, at 304 yards, a dug-in machine gun team. Once at 290 yards, a sniper pinning down a marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. Never more than 1 round per engagement. Fire, move, vanish. Burma punished anyone who stayed still. The cost of victory. By late May, after nearly 3 months and more than 700 miles, Merrill's marauders captured Myitkyina. They succeeded, but the unit was effectively destroyed by disease, exhaustion, and wounds. The marauders were disbanded. George survived. His Winchester survived. But he knew something now. The jungle of Guadalcanal had been a marksman's battlefield. The jungle of Burma belonged to endurance, logistics, and close-range chaos. And the rifle that had changed one war would play a very different role in the next chapter of his life. When the march through Burma finally ended, the war didn't. But the kind of war George fought did. He returned to the United States in 1944, promoted, wounded, and carrying a rifle that had traveled farther than most men in his regiment. By then, the Army was shifting toward mass production, standardized training, and equipment that could be issued by the tens of thousands. Individual marksmanship, the kind that had saved lives at Point Cruz, was disappearing beneath the weight of industrial warfare. George understood the logic. He didn't agree with the cost. So in 1947, while stationed stateside and teaching small unit tactics, he began writing down everything the battlefield had taught him. Not stories of heroism, not dramatized memories. Instead, ballistics, weapon failures, jungle tactics, sniper doctrine, and the brutally honest lessons soldiers learned only when they were far from textbooks. The manuscript grew past 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association convinced him to publish it. George resisted. He thought it was too technical, too dry, too blunt. But in late 1947, it appeared under a title that captured exactly what the book contained: Shots Fired in Anger. It became a quiet classic, one of the most detailed, uncompromising first-hand accounts of small arms combat in the Pacific. Historians still quote it. Collectors search for it. Soldiers study it. George lived long enough to watch 3 more wars unfold, long enough to see sniping become a formal, elite military specialty, an evolution he unknowingly helped begin in those banyan trees. He died in 2009 at 90 years old. His Winchester Model 70 rests today in the National Firearms Museum. Most visitors walk past it without ever knowing what it once did. Look at that rifle now, quiet, unremarkable, resting behind glass. Nothing about it suggests the tension of those 4 days at Point Cruz. Nothing reveals the 11 shots that saved dozens of American lives, or the way one lieutenant's patience rewrote how the Army thought about individual marksmanship. But history is full of moments like this. Moments where a single skill, a single decision, or a single rifle alters the course of a campaign and then fades into silence unless someone chooses to remember. If this story resonated with you, do one small thing that makes a real difference. Hit like, so the algorithm doesn't bury the men who fought in places most people can't find on a map. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're bringing back forgotten battles, weapons, and people every week. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. And if someone in your family served, their stories matter too. Thank you for keeping this history alive.